Welcome to Section 420, Talkin Yankees. Well, we love our Yankees and we love baseball, but how did the game start in the first place? I don't know, but the next guy coming on the show does. His name is Thomas Gilbert. He wrote a number of books, but his most recent title is How Baseball Happened, Outrageous Lies Exposed and the Truth Revealed, and is here to join us now. Hi, Tom. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Thomas Gilbert, people can follow you on Twitter at BaseballHX, as well as check yourself out and about the book, HowBaseballHappened.com. And in case we'll get into your book, How Baseball Happened, Outrageous Lies Exposed, and the Truth Revealed. Again, thank you for joining us. Now, this book, came out last year, 2020, during, the pandemic. Got some awards. I got listed the 2020 Casey Award for Best Baseball Books of the Year, as well as listed on the New York Post list of 32 best books to buy as a gift for 2020. So it seems like this book is connected with a lot of people and got a lot of good accolades.
Yeah, it's really doing well, and it's wonderful to see because I love baseball history, and getting people interested in it is a worthwhile thing to do, and I think it makes every baseball fan and every person a little more knowledgeable about what's going on in their lives, because there's a lot of American history apart from baseball in my book.
Now, about yourself, you're a baseball writer or a general historian. Like, what's your connection with writing and baseball in general?
Well, yeah, I'm a freelance baseball writer. I've never been a beat reporter, but back in the 80s, I did write a column about the Yankees for a magazine, and I covered that hard-hitting team that never quite had enough pitching in the mid-'80s. Since then, I've been mostly writing books. I've written maybe 14.
Oh, wow. And some of the other titles include Roberto Clemente, Baseball in the Color Line, and Playing First, which we get a little bit. But it seems like you have a connection, though, with Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and kind of one of those old original baseball clubs, the Eckford Club, correct?
Yes, a very close connection. If you love baseball, it leads people into history because baseball is so history-filled and history-conscious. I love history, and when I care about something, I want to know more about where it came from and how it developed. And the funny thing about one of the earliest clubs, and this is all stuff that most fans don't really know anything about, but way back in the amateur era in the 1850s, people were forming clubs in Brooklyn and New York City, and one of them was called the Eckfords, and it was based in my neighborhood in Greenpoint, where I'm sitting right now. And for years, I looked for where their original playing grounds was, which was just an open field near a bar. And one day, as I was looking at maps, I realized that my house is in the outfield.
Oh, wow. As for the book, How Baseball Happened, so I guess it seemed like 1911, Aaron Spalding kind of took the first crack at trying to, summarize and tell the history of the game. Now, supposedly, they say like the game was invented in 1845 by a group called the Knickerbockers. But so it seems like that's not exactly really what happened.
Well, that's the interesting thing is, you study baseball history and you begin to realize, well, these stories that baseball has told, there's really two main ones. There's the Knickerbocker story that you just mentioned, and then there's the Doubleday story that everybody's heard that was invented in the early 1900s. You realize that they're not true, and then you realize how not true they are. Because the Doubleday story, for instance, entirely made up. It's 100% phony. And the Knickerbocker story is about 90% wrong. And I always thought, it's not surprising that people get history wrong or that they misremember things. But as I really got into it, researching it, it slowly dawned on me that the people who told the stories originally knew they were wrong. So that raises a really interesting question of why they told them. And I try to answer it in my book. The first thing I do is talk about these origin stories, and then I get to what really happened. And when we look at baseball history, we look at it through the lens of maybe modern fans and thinking of taking for granted that we have professional sports leagues, national professional sports leagues, but we didn't always have these things. And in fact, we didn't always have a sport, adult sport that anybody took seriously. English tourists used to come to America in the pre-Civil War era, and they would say, what's wrong with these Americans? They don't ever, no adults play any sports or get any exercise, which is kind of funny thinking of how interested we are in those things now. So part of the story that I tell in the book is that baseball was invented to be our national sport by people who wanted to do that for specific reasons. So there was no football, basketball, hockey, nothing like that. And the only sports were being played by children. And a bunch of people, basically in New York and Brooklyn, to give the short version, decided that we needed a national sport. And they had very serious reasons. One of them was to unite the country. And this is something else we take for granted, that all over the country we're divided by a lot of things, but we all care about baseball and sports, baseball being the original sport. And the other was for health reasons, because we had public health problems. And there was a whole public health reform movement, and this has nothing to do with professional sports whatsoever. So the amazing part of the story is that this kind of social movement got rolling, and the people that were pushing it are people whose names would mean nothing to you. I tell their stories in my book. They're not well known because they didn't play pro ball. They're pretty forgotten. And this movement got rolling in the mid 1850s, and it goes out from New York and Brooklyn, which were two different cities, spreading around the country intentionally. They intended to spread it. A team called the Excelsiors in 1860 did a tour of the Northeast and then the Middle Atlantic, trying to sell people on the idea of playing baseball. And, it's kind of news to most fans that this was a baseball wilderness, that most parts of the country never heard of it, didn't know what it was. And here's a barnstorming team coming in with great athletes from New York City and Brooklyn, showing people how exciting it could be. By the late 1860s, most people have heard of the Cincinnati Red Stockings that had that undefeated season in 1869, right before the advent of professional baseball. We're talking about 15 years. The sport goes from something that almost no one's ever heard of outside of, say, Lower Manhattan, and everyone thinks of it as the national sport, and everybody's interested in it, and everyone's doing it. And of course, in the middle of that 15-year period, we fought the Civil War, in which everything stopped. So I would say one of the surprising things is how intentional it was. It didn't just evolve. It happened because people made it happen. And who were they? Why were they doing it? This is the story in my book. How did they accomplish it so quickly?
And as you mentioned before, it seems like a lot of this writings and historical tales were almost, made up or told, wrong on purpose. So how are we able to sort of break through that and do your own research to uncover, what really happened?
It's a good question, because that's a big challenge for historians. We all have this problem, which is we have the present. We're immersed in the present, and it's really hard to even see what the issues are sometimes, because we take things for granted. And one example is the people that started baseball, it never occurred to them to make money off of it or to sell tickets or even that anybody would watch. So what they were trying to do is get people to play the game. They thought it was a participant sport, and they didn't do anything to encourage people to watch it, much less buy a ticket to see it. That stuff all happened during the amateur period that I wrote about. But it happened because ordinary people got interested in the game. People in baseball didn't invite them. They sort of crashed the party. And I read about this in the book, how suddenly, really because of the rivalry between New York and Brooklyn, which is obviously has a long history in baseball. But when that rivalry happened, when Brooklyn clubs started being competitive with the New York clubs in the late 1850s, the Brooklyn clubs challenged in 1858 the New York clubs to a best 2 out of 3 all-star series, which sounds like a perfectly ordinary idea now, but it was something that had never happened before. And as the date for the first game approached, people began to realize that there was a massive amount of public interest happening, and they were surprised by this. And the other interesting accident is they had the game at a horse racing track in Queens, right near where Citi Field is. And they had to repair the grass for the horse racing track after this baseball match. So they charged everyone 10 cents. And this happens to be the first time anyone ever played to see a team sporting event in the United States history. And 10,000 people showed up, really surprising everybody. So, there's a lot of things in the story you might not expect to find. The origin stories, and, I've given lots of talks and tours in which I explain to people that the Doubleday thing is completely wrong and the Knickerbocker thing is 90% wrong. And there's always someone that comes up to me and says, how could it be 100% wrong? How could it be that wrong? And that's a really good question. So the basic bottom line short reason is, why do people tell lies? They tell lies. Why do we tell lies about our family history, about ourselves, for a purpose? Not because we're ignorant necessarily. Often we know the truth and we prefer a lie. And that was really true of these baseball stories. They served a specific purpose that I explain in the book, and it has to do with baseball's trying to sell itself. In the case of the Knickerbockers, you want to sell something, you need a story. And there was no one really understood where baseball came from in great detail, but they did have a club full of guys from Wall Street and respectable professions who were playing it, who were conspicuous. And they used them as basically a brand because they were so respectable. It was a way of selling other people who would admire the Knickerbockers on exercise. And the Spalding thing was made up by pro baseball in 1907. And what was the point of that? I mean, it sounds crazy, but the actual point of that was that Albert Spalding was the most powerful owner in baseball and the founder of the National League. And he was annoyed because people were speculating that baseball came from a British game called rounders. And you might have heard this theory. And I say and argue in my book that it's not true. But Spalding, it made him angry because baseball is the American sport. It's invented by Americans. It's all American. It was wrapped in the flag and sold with patriotism. So he had a bunch of experts make up a story that it was invented in 1839 in upstate New York by a teenager named Abner Doubleday. The whole point of the story being very simple, that if somebody invented it in Cooperstown in 1839, it's not British.
And kind of makes sense this with the title, America's National Game, really say, hey, it's America's game.
Yeah, Albert was very knowledgeable about history, but he had a conflict of interest. He was, as I said, sort of the de facto Major League Baseball commissioner, and he was going to do what was good for baseball. And in his view, the idea, even talking about the idea that it might come from England, is off the menu for him. Fighting words.
All right, and in terms of the book itself, so I mean, what was the process in terms of when you got the idea? I want to do this, and how long did it take to you do your research and then finally get a first draft written?
Yeah, well, on one level, it's about 30 years of work since I've spent most of my adult life researching baseball history. But specifically writing and researching this book about 5 years, and it actually started with another book, the book Playing First, which I wrote the book for Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and it's not really a commercial project. The purpose of it was to explain why there's hundreds of important baseball people buried in the same cemetery. Which, there's cemeteries that have a few Hall of Famers in them, but Greenwood has literally hundreds of important early ball players in it. And I'd always interested me, and I wrote a book trying to explain why. And what I realized in the process of writing that book is there's all these big baseball questions. Why was baseball the first sport? Why do we need a national sport? How did it spread so quickly? What were the people who spread it thinking? Why did they tell these origin stories? Why didn't we play cricket is a good question. Other British colonies play cricket. So why do we have to have our own sport? These questions I began to realize when I was writing about the lives of people buried in Greenwood. They really are, the answers are not on the baseball field. They're in their regular lives. And it's important to remember that the people that built baseball as our national sport were all amateurs. Professional baseball, who got paid is a tough question, but professional baseball, the first national professional league starts in 1871. And by that time, all these amateurs that I'm writing about, who mostly had other lives and other jobs, had already built a national sport. And this is a story most people haven't heard.
Talking about some of the pioneers of the game, one of them, which probably a lot of people don't know, and I was surprised if he was a gentleman by the name of James Creighton, who completely changed the game where used to be that a pitcher would throw the ball where the hitter wanted it, which great for a hitter, but he actually changed the game where then he made it tougher for the hitters, again using a fastball and some early breaking balls, and really just changed the game from, again, just being a hitter hitting where you want, where now you have it like today, where it's, the pitcher versus the batter and kind of a one-on-one, man-on-man duel.
Yeah, it's hard to think. I compare him to Babe Ruth, who people say changed the game, right? By introducing home run hitting. This is a bigger change by any measure. I mean, the idea, as you said, in the early days of amateur baseball, the pitcher was supposed to serve the ball to the hitter and let him hit it. And you read game accounts from 1854, and you'll see a lot of games that are 60 to 50. Basically, it was like a kind of a slope, kind of a modified softball pickup game where people would just hit the ball as hard as they could, and the team that played better defense won. Creighton, there's a mystery to Creighton because the rules when he came along in the late 1850s and early 1860s, he was a Brooklyn kid. The rules were designed to prevent a pitcher from throwing hard. They actually say, if you read them, the official rules, that you have to throw the ball. The best way to understand it for a modern person is the way you'd throw it if you were pitching horseshoes. You had to keep your arms stiff and you had to throw it dead underhand. And they used to actually run up to a line and flip it like that. And, I was at an event in Cincinnati and I asked former Major League pitcher Tom Browning, I figured it's a good person to ask. I'd explained the pitching rules and said, how hard do you think you could throw like this? And he said, 40. That's about right. So Creighton, we don't know exactly what he was doing. We have a few clues because people described his delivery, but he somehow figured out how to throw much harder than that. Like, it sounds like he's throwing something like a modern fast pitch softball pitcher. And he was really dominating. And he may have been throwing a curveball. That's kind of undeterminable, but it sounds like he might have been. People talk about all kinds of movement and, when somebody invents something, there's no word for it. So it's hard to tell what they're talking about, but they talk about twist and movement and command. And one of the big clues about what he was doing was he didn't run up to the line. He actually took one stride and kind of untwisted like a modern pitcher, which to me might mean that he was throwing a curveball, which is pretty hard to throw running. And I have a whole chapter about it in my book because it's so interesting. And this transformed baseball completely, making a pitcher into a weapon. The ultimate end result of Creighton's, whatever he was doing, which he was accused of cheating, and experts looked at it and said, no, it looks legal to us. So we're a little bit mystified about what he was really doing. But we know the effect it had, which is he was dominating. It ultimately resulted in the strike zone because there was no strike zone until he came along. And what batters did when they saw a guy throwing twice as hard as anything they'd ever seen, it would be like, what would major league hitters do if they had no strike zone and Sid Finch came along throwing 140? They wouldn't swing, right? So they didn't. You had to find a way to make them swing. This all happened in the early 1860s, and it ends up resulting in the strike zone. The strike zone is the most important thing in baseball. And it's really the indirect result of one guy's innovation, figuring out how to throw something like modern pitching. So it's a really interesting story. Not to mention that he died at 21. And I'll let people buy my book and find out what happened there, because that's the other mystery of Creighton.
And in addition to James Creighton, are there a couple other names that are also in that Greenwood Cemetery?
Oh, yeah. There's Henry Chadwick, who actually wasn't a top player at all. But he was the first journalist that advocated for baseball, and the support of the newspapers was a big factor in spreading the game. I mean, newspapers didn't have sports sections until the 1850s. And Chadwick was kind of a visionary. He was a guy that came from England to Brooklyn when he was 13 and really primarily played cricket himself and was interested in that. But he was writing about cricket for the New York Times. And cricket existed in America at this time, but pretty much in a bubble of immigrants from Great Britain, of whom there were a lot. Americans had kind of mixed feelings about cricket. A lot of them played it, but they weren't going to, it wasn't a candidate for our national pastime when that issue arose for patriotic reasons. But the fascinating thing about Chadwick is he saw the possibility of baseball as being America's national sport very early. And he did everything he could to promote it. And, a lot of the stuff, accounts of games and the baseball stories that we read now are written by him. And he covered baseball for many publications. He actually invented most of the modern stats. So he was sort of the father of analytics. He said, in order for the game to be self-improving, we have to understand performance. We have to understand, who's the better second baseman and how and why. And he thought statistics were the key to that. Of course, they are. We still use them for this purpose. But he invented batting average and lots of the stats that we use, and he actually invented the box score. And if you go to Greenwood Cemetery, he lived a long life. He died in, I think, 1908, working for professional baseball. And the Spalding Guide, that used to be the annual baseball guide, he was the editor of it for about 40 years. Chadwick's grave is worth visiting in Greenwood because it's a marble column with a a marble baseball on top with stitches, bronze baseball equipment all over it, and they have clay base paths and marble bases. Really quite beautiful.
And you mentioned before that, again, before the league came together, so you have a lot of these barnstorming clubs. Now, it's around 1860s when, we have the Civil War going on. Was it, I mean, even though some of those fights were taking place out west or, down south, I mean, did that create any difficulty for these teams to, travel across the country or up in Canada?
That's a really good question. And it's something that historians are really divided about is exactly how did the war affect baseball? And, I have my point of view in my book. But it's a little bit mysterious because baseball was making great progress and then the war breaks out. It had already spread to California and parts of the South that were associated with New York, like New Orleans, and it was spreading around the country in the late 1850s. Then the war happens and it sort of stops, especially at the top level. Like no one's going to have a baseball championship series when there's a war on. People were playing here and there and they played in the military, but it didn't get covered. And to return to one of your earlier questions, 90% of what we know about this period is in newspapers. So stuff that doesn't get covered in newspapers tends to be in the darkness for us as historians. And you can go to diaries and letters and things, but Civil War, sports is a secondary priority. And what we have is we have anecdotes. So we have, I have a whole file of all the games that we know about that were played, and you can see patterns in them. I mean, the New Yorkers were all baseball mad. So all the New York units are playing baseball against each other whenever they have downtime. And I think the bottom line, the short answer to what the war did for baseball was it spread it to what we call the Midwest. And it was simply because out of the 3 million people that served in the Union Army, 400,000 of them were New Yorkers in their 20s, most of whom were playing baseball by then. So you mix those guys with guys from Wisconsin and Missouri and Indiana, and what you do is you spread the game. And I think that actually did happen. There's a lot of mythology about it, and there's lots of people love to write in military memoirs how they put up a flag of truce and we played a game with the Confederates and stuff. And most of those stories probably not true. But it definitely spread west, and that was a big important factor in the spread of baseball. On the cover of my book, there's a picture of a game from a prison camp in 1862. It's all Union prisoners playing on July 4th. It's a fascinating picture.
The game itself, I guess there were a couple of rules that were different. I think you used to be able to throw the ball at the runner instead of tagging. Obviously, you can't do that today, but
yeah, that's something that was in sort of the primitive versions of baseball that was eliminated early in the amateur era. I mean, actually, we played that way when I was a kid. Maybe you did too, but that rule is still around in folk games. But if we could take a time machine and go back to, say, the mid 1850s, it would be pretty interesting because first of all, they're pitching underhand. And as I said, until Creighton comes along, they're pitching pretty slow. Pitchers were known for their ability to get batters off balance, but you're on your honor to throw the ball over the plate. There was a limit to how much you could do. There's no gloves. So if you've ever seen Chicago 16-inch softball, it probably looks something like that. Everyone's fielding barehanded. In fact, early in the amateur period, you could field the ball on one hop for an out. You didn't have to catch it in the air. That tells you something about how hard they're hitting the ball and what it would do to your fingers. As I said, the games they originally played to 21 runs instead of 9 innings, which tells you how high scoring the games were, right? How long would it last if we played to 21 runs? Now the Yankees would probably take a week. But that ended because defense got better and the scores went down, and you would end up not finishing the game. My favorite thing about early baseball is the catcher. So if you look at pictures of pre-Civil War baseball, this poor catcher, he has no shin guards, no face mask, nothing. Now, when there's no one on base, you can see in these drawings that he's 40 feet behind the plate, taking the ball in a couple of hops, which is what you and I would do to save our faces. But what does he do when there's 2 strikes and he wants to catch a foul tip, or there's men on base? So you see he's up behind the batter like this, trying to keep his cheekbone from getting broken. And catchers got messed up, and they were very, very brave, courageous people. I mean, they were tough as nails. These guys were really impressive. And the role of the catcher was where you put your best athlete in pre-Civil War baseball.
Yeah, I mean, they take a beating today, but I can only imagine back then. So really quickly, again, you have all these little baseball clubs. So how did actually the, Major League Baseball, as we know today, get together and form and now have some teams to start an entire league?
Really, professional baseball became inevitable from the moment those people paid 10 cents to see that All-Star series in 1858. And entrepreneurs who had nothing to do with baseball, they noticed this. 10,000 people paying money to see something. And a guy in Brooklyn who had nothing to do with baseball directly built a ballpark in Williamsburg in 1862. The whole purpose of it was to make money. He told all these clubs, you can use this beautiful field in my dressing rooms, and I'm going to charge admission to the fans, but you can use it for free, which sounds great until you start seeing how much money he's making. But this is the thing that makes professional baseball inevitable. But in between that and an actual professional league in 1871 is you have these great Eastern teams like Brooklyn Atlantics, like the New York Mutuals, the Unions of Morrisania, the Philadelphia Athletics. And what they do is they take tours around the country, and they go to Pittsburgh and St. Louis and Chicago and Cincinnati, and everybody pays 25 cents to see them destroy the best team in their area, because these teams were unbeatable. And it was like a traveling road show. And there's all kinds of interesting stories about it and controversy. And occasionally they would lose a game to a team in Buffalo, and everybody would say they're throwing it on purpose to manipulate the betting odds. But you know what that is that's the beginning of professional baseball, because this is something else we take for granted. Professional baseball is organized around road trips. And this is because this is a baseball tradition going back to the amateur era, right? We always call a team the home and visitors, even if they're both in the Greenpoint Little League and they're both home. So the idea of traveling and then the other team returning the favor by visiting you, this is something that goes back to the very early days of baseball. And the greatest traveling team was the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, who most people have heard of because they were undefeated for an entire season. 1869, they went 57-0, I think it was. That was the team that went all over the country, coast to coast. They went to California, they went to the Deep South. They made money, and they just showed, they basically showed the way to the first professional league. They inspired the founding of the first professional league. And that was something that called the National Association in 1871, and didn't really work. So the National League replaced it in 1876, and that's our National League. So that's the short version. But the traveling part of it is essential.
Well, Thomas, appreciate you joining us, sharing some of these great stories. Now, again, people can follow you on Twitter at BaseballHX, as well as learn more about yourself, how baseball happened, Outrageous Lies Exposed, The Truth Revealed, and some of your previous titles, such as Playing First, again, regarding some of those players in the Greenwood Cemetery. So, Thomas, thank you again for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.